So you want to knit, but you have no idea where to start. You don't even know what to search for. And trust me, I get it. A year ago, I was exactly where you are at now. As my professor in university would like to put it, I was in a state of unconscious incompetence. I didn't know what I didn't know. And yet, 700 hours and 20 garments later, I feel like I finally gained the courage to knit anything that I want. And I want to help you get there too. That's why I came up with this 3-part video series titled Pre-knitting, Peri-knitting, and Post-knitting, which condenses everything you need to know to start your knitting journey. This is the second part of the series, Peri-knitting. Before I move on further into the actual video itself, hi, I'm Yvette. Over here I talk about all things art, from painting to knitting, and in this video specifically, it is a deep dive into all the things you need to know to start knitting. So just grab a cup of tea, grab your knitting or a notebook if you are planning to take notes. I'm just again having some water with me, and let's begin. So I have my iPad over here for me to look at my notes. So this is the second video, and in the previous video I talked about how to get started in terms of choosing your knitting needles, your equipment, your notions, your yarn, your project, how to get it all sorted out and how to start the planning process. And so now, given that you, I assume, already have your knitting needles, your yarn, and your project in mind, let's get started to the actual process of knitting. There are a couple of things I want to talk about before I actually talk about the core techniques that I think you need to know when knitting. The first thing is that there are different kinds of knitting styles. For me, I knit the continental style. I started doing crochet before knitting. I only started crocheting from maybe, I want to say a couple of months. I think like 4 or 5 months before knitting at most. So I wouldn't say that I was a very advanced crocheter either before I started knitting. But in general, if you're someone who has done crochet before, I do hear that people find it easier to learn continental knitting as opposed to the other kind of knitting styles when doing the transition from crochet to knitting. But otherwise, there are other kind of knitting styles as well, which is English knitting or flick knitting. English knitting is basically when you hold the yarn in your right hand. I'll of course show a video of me doing it, and I'm obviously not the most well versed in English knitting. I only ever do that when I'm doing color work. The other option is also flick knitting, which I find much easier than English knitting because it is a bit more of a seamless kind of step in which when you insert your right needle into your life stitch, you're winding the yarn around your needle at the same time, rather than the English knitting style, which you put in your needle first and then wrap your yarn around and then take your needle back out. And I find that a little bit more of a longer process, which I find that to be a bit less harmonious in its process for me versus flick knitting, which I find is a bit more cohesive for me. So the other option is of course continental style, in which you hold the yarn in your left hand while you knit. Of course, there are many other kinds of knitting styles as well, and I'm not here to go too in depth into that. Well, it is just to inform you guys that there are different kinds of knitting styles, and it is really up to you to find the style that works best for you. And so I'm going to be showing you guys how to tension the yarn, how to hold the yarn, and different kind of techniques like knitting, purling, doing some increases, fixing your mistakes, all in this second part of this video. But before we move on to the table area, I just want to give some tensioning tips as well. I do find that as a new knitter, we tend to hold the yarn a little bit tightly because we're really afraid of either dropping the stitch or losing the yarn, in terms of the yarn not being able to be wound well against the knitting needle. So to compensate, we are really knitting really tightly. And I just want to say that you don't have to knit too tightly. Of course, you want to knit in such a way that your stitches are kind of really nicely pressed against the dress. Of course, this is not like some model work that you guys should totally follow exactly, but this is how the stitches should kind of look like against the knitting needle. It shouldn't be so loose that you can see a gap between the stitches and against the knitting needle, but it shouldn't be so tight either that you feel like the stitches are really pressed against the knitting needle and it's like really difficult to move them along the knitting needle. So that's like just roughly how I check to see if I'm like knitting too tightly or knitting too loosely. One way to make sure that you're not knitting too tightly or too loosely is to make sure that when you put your knitting needle through, you just give a little tug to the needle. So I will show you guys again at the table area, but basically when you put your needle through and you want to wind the stitch over, when you're bringing this knitting needle back over, you just give a tiny tug like that while the knitting needle is still on before pulling the stitch out. Once it's out, try not to pull it too tightly afterwards, because that's when I find that it is sometimes a little bit too tight. And also another thing is that you don't want to be knitting on the ends of your knitting needles. You don't want to be knitting at this point here. You can tell that this knitting needle, it is a little point area. I hope it's focusing, but you can see that it kind of tapers in at the end over here. And so some people, they are knitting so closely towards the edge of your knitting needle that the circumference of your stitch ends up being that of the pointed tip. This is a 4mm needle. This edge is not 4mm. It is only 4mm from this point on down. And so if you're knitting all the way at the ends of your tip, at the pointed section of it, and you are kind of gauging the size of your live stitch based on that, then your stitches are too small and they will end up really, really tight. So try not to do that. Make sure that it goes all the way down before you release it. And don't knit with the tips of the knitting needle, if that makes sense. And now let's move on to the table area, where I'll show you guys the different core techniques. Alright, so we are going to begin. There are a couple of things that I think are super essential for you guys in beginning to start knitting your first garment. The first thing that I want to teach you guys is the cast on, and there are obviously many different cast on methods, but this is the long tail cast on that I am teaching you guys. The first thing that you have to do is to measure out the tail. So assuming that you need to cast on 10 stitches, you just want to wrap your yarn 10 times around your knitting needle. Do it loosely, not too tightly, and then this is the length that you need to cast on your 10 stitches. And after you're done with that, you just want to lengthen it a little bit more, so that after you're done casting on, you have enough yarn left behind for weaving in your ends, which I'll be talking about in the third episode. You want to tie a little knot at the end. Just do a simple knot. Just twist it and then pull it through. Make sure that the yarn that you're pulling through is not the tail end, but the yarn that is attached to the yarn ball, because you don't want to end up eating the yarn that you portioned off to be the tail. I'm just gonna show you guys again. So just twist it and then loop it through and pull through to make a little knot. So something like that. And after you're done, just loop it through your knitting needle. You want the tail end to be closer to you, so at the front, and you want the yarn that is attached to the ball to be at the back. And I'm going to show you guys how to hold these two pieces. So kind of go in like an L shape, and you want your thumb to be under the tail end, and you want the index finger to be under the yarn that is attached to the yarn ball. And so just go in an L shape and use your 3 fingers to hold the yarn tightly so that it wouldn't come loose when you're doing your casting on. And so just something like that to make sure that it's really tensioned well. You want to put your thumb underneath the tail end of the yarn, and also you want to hold the extra yarn with your 3 fingers, so that your 3 fingers are actually holding all the excess yarns and making sure that they are really tensioned well. Put your knitting needle underneath that yarn, loop it through with your index finger, make a circle and pull it tight. Let me show you guys one more time, because I know it's quite complicated sometimes. Use your right knitting needle, put it underneath the first line. You can see that there are 3 lines created by the thumb and the index finger. Go underneath the thumb, use your index finger to go over with the yarn, and then loop it through once more. And this is your long tail cast on. So one more time underneath the yarn, the first one right at the bottom, use a right knitting needle to go underneath it, use your index finger, go over, and with your thumb, the last one, pull it over the knitting needle as well. So I'm just showing you guys the same motion a couple of times so that you guys can get the hang of it, and I think it is easier to just watch me doing it versus me trying to explain it verbally. So this is how it works. Bear in mind that the loop that you created right at the start, the one that you looped your right knitting needle in, is considered your first cast on stitch. So if you want to do 10 stitches, you just actually need to do this whole casting on process 9 times, because the first stitch is already done by the knot. And this is your simple long tail cast on. You don't want to do it too tightly, you don't want to do it too loosely either. You just want to have the right amount of tension. It might take a while to get used to it, but after you get the hang of it, it is definitely much easier. So after you're done your long tail cast on, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie a little knot at the tail ends so that you guys will be able to know which is the tail. And I'm so sorry, this is actually my second time filming this entire tutorial and my camera just can't seem to focus very well. I think because the yarn is really small and everything is just really small when it comes to knitting. I tried to use bigger yarn and bigger needles, but unfortunately this is like the biggest that I could find. So yeah, but basically what I'm explaining here is that you can see that there is an active stitch that are on the knitting needles, and these are like your active live stitches. Live stitches have two legs. One leg is at the front of the needle, the other leg is at the back of the needle. Whenever you're knitting a normal knit and purl stitch, you want to knit into the front leg. Of course, there are some instances where you end up knitting with your back leg instead, but for all intents and purposes, this is a normal knit stitch, this is a normal purl stitch, so everything goes through the front leg. So for your knit stitch, you want to use your right needle and go through the front leg from left to right, loop the yarn over and pull it out. I'm going to show this many times, so don't worry, you can kind of just follow through. And also there are many different ways in which you can hold on to your yarn. This is generally how I like to hold on to my yarn, with just the index finger to tension it. And this is how I do a normal knit stitch. Other ways in which you can hold on to the yarn is by looping it twice around your index finger. In my opinion, this allows, in my opinion, the yarn to kind of be a bit more taut. Another way is you can loop it with your pinky, put the yarn over your 3 fingers, and then once again hold on to the left needle with your left hand. And this also really helps to keep the tension nice and good. Of course, there's no hard and fast rule in terms of how you want to hold your yarn. This is a matter of personal preference. For me, it was a little bit of trial and error before I found the way that I like to hold my yarn. So you just tension your yarn like that, and then put your needle through from front to back, left to right, and then you use your yarn to wrap it clockwise from left to right over the needle, like so, as you can see. So I'm doing this a couple of times to show you guys the general movement. I'm trying to do it as slowly as possible, but I can't go any slower than that because otherwise it would just cause me to lose control of my yarn. So if you guys need it to be slower, you can kind of change the speed of this video to maybe a 0.5 times speed. That might be a bit better. And another thing as well is, before you pull out your yarn, you just want to give a tiny tug on the working yarn to make sure that your stitch is molded to the 4.5mm needles. If you end up knitting too loosely, your stitches may end up being bigger than the knitting needle size that you're using, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of using a 4.5mm needle in this case. So after we're done with the knit stitch, this is how an entire row of knit stitches look like, and I'm gonna flip over to the wrong side of the work. So this is what we call reverse stockinette. You can see all the little bumps there, and on the front side, the right side of your work, that is what we call stockinette stitch. So now moving on to the reverse side, I am on the wrong side of the work, and I'm going to show you guys how to do purling now. And mind you, purling is harder than knitting. In my opinion, I find purling something that is a little bit harder to grasp and to master. So the difference between purling and knitting is, purling is kind of the opposite of knitting. You are still working the front leg, but instead of going left to right, I am going from right to left, and now my yarn is going anti-clockwise. So instead of left to right over the needle, I'm going right to left over the needle. A lot of people, when you first get started knitting, myself included, I actually pulled the wrong way and I ended up twisting my stitches. So you may end up with this phenomenon of twisting stitches, and that is really common as well, so don't beat yourself up too hard about it. Just, if you're not sure if you're twisting your stitches or not, just come back to this video and see the right way to wrap your yarn around your knitting needle. The general rule of thumb to check if you are twisting your stitches is to pull your knitting, like gently pull it, and if your stitches are opening up, that is a sign that your stitches are not twisted. But if your stitches end up looking like they are unable to be pulled apart, that is a sign that you're twisting your stitches. I did talk about it a little bit more in the later part of the video. So I'm just doing the pulling a couple of times. Really nothing much to do. It's basically the same as knitting, just the opposite. So that's just how you purl. And this is how it looks like after you're done with an entire round of purling. Let me show you guys how to join in the round. So for example, I am casting on a new top. This is the Cicada summer top that I am super excited to start working on because I just feel like this top is just so beautiful. Anyway, I digress. So I finished casting on all of my stitches. This is my tail, so I just tied it up to get it out of the way and make it really noticeable that is the tail. And this is the number of stitches that I've cast on, and now I want to start working in the round, which means working in one circle like that. So before we join in the round, I want to make sure that my stitches are all facing the same direction. So you can see all these areas over here, this line over here, it must be facing the same direction, and make sure that nothing is twisted. We don't want a situation where we've joined in a round, done a few rounds, and realized that our fabric is actually twisted. We don't want it to look like that. So just turn it to make sure that your stitches are all facing the same direction. So now that we have gotten our stitches and make sure that it's all facing the same direction, what I want to do right now is to take my stitch marker. I have this really obvious orange stitch marker, and I'm going to put it over here, and what I'm gonna do is just to start knitting. So start knitting like that. The first stitch is always the most finicky. It's always going to be a bit looser, so just knit it like that and then pull it through, and then just continue working in the direction. So with this way of doing it, let's say if I were to just continue knitting in a round just like that without doing the seamless join in a round, it still works, but it's just not so nice. It always gets a little bit loose. This area over here always ends up a little bit loose, and so if you want to avoid that, what you can do is this technique called the seamless join in around. So what I do is I bring, once again, make sure everything is facing the same direction. I'm going to take this last stitch over here, bring it over to the right hand side, take the second last stitch, but bring it up and over, and then just continue to knit in the round. So let's do that again. I am going to take this stitch from the left and bring it to the right needle. I'm going to use my left needle and bring it through the second last stitch. Bring it up and over. And there you have it, a seamless join in the round. Just make sure you pull everything to make sure it is nice and neat. And then what you can do from here on is to just simply continue knitting in the round, and I'll show you guys how it looks like after a couple of stitches. If you want to do it and the pattern doesn't call for it, what you can do is always cast on one extra stitch than what a pattern calls for. And you can see that over here is much more secure and stable. So I like this method for a seamless join in the round. Turning back to the right side of my work, I am going to show you guys now how to do some increases, because there will come a certain time in your knitting journey where you have to do some increases, some decreases as well, but for today's video, let's just talk increases because I find that that is more prevalent in knitting garments. Unless you're planning to knit, just a straight rectangle forever, you will eventually have to start doing some increases and decreases. Okay, so I'm just gonna be knitting all the way to sort of the center point, and I'm gonna show you guys how to do it in the middle of the garment. And I'm just gonna do it with one stitch right in the middle that is untouched, so that you guys can see the difference between the stitches that are leaning to the left. And now I'm just pulling the garment a little bit apart so that you guys can see the leather rungs that are forming as a result. So you'll be able to see all these kind of straight horizontal lines that are kind of joining the knit stitches on the left and on the right hand side. And I'm sorry that it got a bit blurry. I've been trying to figure out this camera focus settings when it comes to knitting, you know, small stuff. I very rarely film tutorials, so I am not too well versed in filming, so I'm so sorry that it is a bit blurry, but I think you can still get the idea that you can see the different leather rungs. And when we are doing an increase, we want to work on the topmost rung. So use your right knitting needle. You want to go from right to left, front to back, and mount it on top of your left needle. So this is a make one right, which means that the stitch that you're creating will be leaning to the right. So after you mount it up, you just want to knit it like you would a normal knit stitch. And I'll show you guys one more time. Bring your leather rung up onto the left needle. Make sure that the left side of your yarn is on the front and the right side of your yarn is on the back. So it looks something like that. So after you're done with that, it is super simple. Just knit it like you would a normal knit stitch. Sometimes it can feel a little bit clumsy because it is going to be a bit tight to knit into, because you're creating a new stitch out of nothing in that sense. So because of that, sometimes you need to just work it a little bit more, and it will feel a bit awkward at the start. So now I'm moving on to the make one left, and making one left is the opposite of make one right. So you mount your stitch differently, where the right leg of your yarn is on the front of the needle and the left side of your yarn is on the back of the needle. Now you want to put your right needle in from right to left, and you kind of just want to go over to the back. So bring it up and over onto the back side of your knitting, or of your knit stitch. And then you just want to knit it like you would normally. And I'm so sorry, I couldn't stop myself from holding it in place, but you get the idea. You're just kind of putting your stitching from right to left, front to back. And I know it cut, but I'm going to show you guys how to do both the make one right and the make one left one more time. So I'm going to be showing the make one right first. So you want to work into the leather rung. So for the make one right, once again, work into the leather rung, the topmost leather rung, and then mount it onto your left needle, and then just knit it like you would normally. The middle stitch I'm not touching, so I'm just doing a normal knit stitch. And now for the make one left, you are mounting your yarn from the opposite side, so where your right side of your stitch is on the front. And it looks something like that. I'm just holding it there for a while so that you guys will know how to mount it. And afterwards, you just want to put your right needle from right to left and in the front, and then afterwards you just bring it up and over. Honestly, you can just do it immediately from the back, but for some reason I just find it easier to do it like that. And then you just knit it like you would normally. And so this is how you do a make one right and a make one left. It is pretty simple. After a while you will get it. Now I want to show you guys how to do a make one right purl and a make one left purl, because sometimes in some rare occasions, but it does happen, you do have to do an increase on the wrong side of your work. So I've worked to where I think is the middle point of my work, and now same thing, you just want to work into the leather rung, the topmost leather rung. So okay, so same thing again, you want to just look at the leather rung, and this is the make one right purl. You're mounting it exactly how you would make one right knit, and instead of knitting you just purl it. So it's really, for the make one right purl and the make one right knit, it is more or less exactly the same, just that instead of knitting you are pulling. There's really not much fuss when it comes to making a right leaning stitch. So just purl like you would normally. The difficulty comes about when you're trying to do a big one left purl, and I'll show you guys why it is difficult in just a short moment. And now let's move on to the big one left purl. This one you're mounting it exactly how you would a big one left knit. So I'm just holding my yarn at the front, and I'm just putting my topmost leather rung onto the left needle like you would a big one left knit. The difference now is because you're purling, you can't purl through the front area, so instead you want to purl through the back leg. And so I'm just going to show you guys how to do this as best as I can. I find it really difficult to film this part, and I tried my best as possible to hold my work as flat and stagnant as possible, but it's really difficult. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm mounting it up as I would a make one left knit, and then I am working with the back leg, so behind my left needle, from left to right I go in like that, and then I am just going to purl normally. So if you can master this, everything else would be easy, and if you can't, it's okay. It's the hardest. It takes some time to get used to it. And now I'm going to show you guys how everything looks like from the right side of your work, because at this point in time I have done quite a few increases. You can see my tapestry needle is pointing on the left, and that's the make one left side, and on the right hand side you can see it's a make one right. So you can see how it really contributes to that visual effect of a leading left stitch and a leading right stitch. Now we get to the point where you need to add a new ball of yarn. I'm using a different color so that you guys will be able to tell clearly what I'm doing, but usually if you guys have to add a new ball of yarn, it is probably because you've run out of your first ball of yarn and you need to add another. So let's say that I have knit maybe 4 stitches and I've run out of my blue yarn. So I'm going to add this really nice contrasting red color yarn, and once again be sure to leave behind a long enough tail so that you can weave in your ends after. And now I'm just going to hold my tail with my right hand, and I'm going to tension the other working yarn with my left hand, and I'm going to do 1 knit stitch. And what I did after that was to put my red yarn over my blue yarn to kind of trap it in place, and then I do 1 more blue stitch and then 1 more red stitch where I trapped the blue yarn over the red yarn, something like that. And then I am going to knit 1 more time with the red yarn. I'm going to do this alternating, so once again I'm just going to put the red yarn over the blue yarn, and while doing so sometimes I like to pull on my yarn tails to kind of lock them in place. And so I'm just putting the yarn like that over to kind of block it, and then I knit with my red yarn. After doing this like a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, I can continue on with the new yarn. And I'm just going to continue going on for a couple of rows to show you guys the difference, but you can tell that it's a really seamless addition of yarn. So this is a way of adding yarn for every type of yarn fiber that you're using. But if you're going to use 100% non-superwash wool, that means wool and yarn that can be felted, then you can use this method called spit splicing. And I did attach a video into my Knitting 101 playlist down below, so you guys can go check that out. But that is a much easier method of adding new yarn, but that only works if you're using 100% non-superwash wool. If you're using any other kind of wool, even superwash wool, they don't felt, so that method won't work and your work will just come undone. So this is how it looks like after I've done a few rows of the new yarn. You can tell that it looks really seamless attention wise. It looks more or less the same, and everything looks really nice. You can see that the portion that I'm pointing to is the alternate stitch between the old and the new yarn, and everything looks really nice and seamless. Of course, you just want to pull it a little bit to just make sure that the tension kind of evens out a little bit more. And on the wrong side, this is how it looks like as well. It is super neat. So last thing is troubleshooting. There will be instances that you drop your knit stitch or you did a wrong stitch and you have to redo that one. So let's say I'm knitting and I've dropped a couple of rows down. Fret not all hope is lost. First thing you want to do is to find your live stitch. So it is this stitch over here. I am just using a tapestry needle to kind of pull it up a little bit so that I don't end up losing it again. And I just keep it on my tapestry needle so that I won't lose it. And now the next thing you want to do is to identify your letter rungs. So same as you were doing your increases, once again I have to look for the letter rungs. So you can tell that there are 2 letter rungs that are really obvious right now, and so it tells me that I have dropped 2 stitches 2 rows down. To fix this issue, I just mount my stitch back up on my left needle and make sure that it's mounted up the correct way. So if you mount it this way, it is wrong. And how you tell that it's wrong, if you try to knit it, look at the stitches kind of crossing. The leg is getting crossed together, and that is wrong. So for this case, you see it's mounted correctly, and when I put my needle in, it opens up really nicely. So that's how you tell that your knit stitch is opening up nicely and it's not crossed. So this is how you tell that your knit stitch is not twisted. So rule of thumb, once again, always make sure that the right side of your stitch is on the front of your needle and the left side of your stitch is on the back of the needle. So after you've mounted your live stitch up on your needle, you want to kind of do it like you would make one left knit. So mount your first letter rung, the one that is most at the bottom, onto the left needle, and use your right needle to bring your live stitch up and over the letter rung. So bring it up and over the letter rung. Make sure that your letter rung stitch is mounted correctly as well, so always the right side of your stitch on the front. Bring it up and over and just pull it a little bit to just help with the tension. So this is just how I do it. If you do it a couple of times, you can fix a dropped stitch with a knitting needle. I personally like to fix it with a crochet hook. So I have a 4mm crochet hook, which works just fine. And I find a crochet hook much easier to fix dropped stitches, especially ones that have dropped many rows down. So once again, I pull up my fabric apart to make sure that your crochet hook goes in correctly. So you can see that my stitch is not twisted. So just put it in through like this. And what you want to do if you do crochet is to do a slip stitch. So once again, you just need to find your letter rungs. Make sure you're working into all of the letter rungs. Sometimes if you're working with smaller needles or if you've dropped many rows down, chances are the letter rungs won't be so visible as what is happening right now. Sometimes the letter rungs are really short, so you gotta really make sure that you're pulling your fabric far enough apart and making sure that you've gotten every single letter rung. Make sure you're doing a slip stitch into the bottommost letter rung and then slowly work your way up. So just pull it through. Okay, hook onto the letter rung and pull it through the live stitch. Make sure to mount it back on correctly once again. So I'm going to show you again visually how to check if your stitch is twisted or not. So you can see in my case it is not twisted, but if I were to put it the other way, it is twisted. I hope this gives you a more clearer idea visually, because I think the second time I did it was much clearer. That is how you fix your mistakes. You don't have to frog back like you would in crochet. Now, supposing that I dropped a stitch on the wrong side of my work, honestly, you can fix it on the wrong side of the work if you want, and there's a way to do so, but this is knitting 101, so I'm just gonna show you guys the easy way. Just turn your work to the right side, easy, and fix it on the right side. It makes it so much easier this way, and you just do the same way of troubleshooting. Mount it back onto any needle. You don't have to think too much. the left side works, the right side works for now, okay? And then you just turn your work back onto the wrong side, and of course you can see where my working yarn is attached to, and you can tell that the stitch that I fixed had not been worked into yet. So transfer it back onto the left needle, making sure that it is mounted correctly, which means the right side of the stitch is once again on the front of the needle. So usually for like a purling stitch that is dropped, I usually end up mounting it wrongly, so I always have to kind of refix it. But usually if I remember that the right side of my stitch has to be the front of the needle, I always know how to fix it and how to mount it and how to remount it correctly. So that is how you troubleshoot for both the right and the wrong side of your work. And this is how it looks like from the front, our tiny piece that we worked today. Doesn't she look so cute? Now I'm going to show you guys how to cast off or bind off, and this is the simplest method to bind off release, and you can use either a knitting needle or once again a crochet hook. My personal preference is a crochet hook. It is just chef's kiss, so easy. Always use a crochet hook or a knitting needle, whichever. Use one that is 1 or 2 sizes up. I always like to use at least 2 sizes up. In this case, I'm using a 6mm crochet hook and knitting needle because that is all I have. Even though my knitting needle was 4.5mm for the knitting up of this garment, so I went up by a whole millimeter size, but it works. Reason being is because you don't want your bind off edge to be too tight. So I'm going to show you guys with the crochet hook first. It is super easy, so I'll just show you the easier method first. You just want to use it like a knitting needle. So for the first stitch, you're just knitting it like you would a normal knit stitch. Knit the second one, and after you're done knitting the second one, snip stitch it through the first stitch. Essentially, yeah, this is how you cast off. It is super simple and really easy to learn and really fast to do. So now I'm going to show you how to cast off with a knitting needle, which is honestly a little bit more cumbersome for me. So once again, knit 2 stitches. Always make sure you have 2 stitches on your knitting needle before you do any bind off. Then use the left needle to go up and over the most recently knitted stitch. And because it is kind of hard to do so, I always find that I end up dropping the most recently knitted stitch. What I usually like to do is to pull really tightly with my left index finger, so that the stitch becomes smaller and it's easier for my stitch on the right to go over the stitch on the left. So that's just a small hack that I like to do if I'm somehow binding off with a knitting needle. So you can see how tightly I'm pulling on my second stitch when I'm binding off. And I find that this method works really well to bring the stitch quite nicely up and over the second stitch. After you're done with this, just grab a scissors, make sure to cut off enough to have an end to weave in, and then just pull on the loop all the way through and you are done. This is how it looks like, and these are the basic things that you need to know to start knitting your first garment. Okay, so that was a pretty long and condensed tutorial. I tried to put in all the things that I think are essential to start knitting your first garment. Of course, there are a few other techniques as well, which I will just give an honorary mention, but I don't think are essential to know to start knitting your first garment. But of course, if you are planning to do maybe a slightly more intermediate kind of pattern, then I would recommend looking up things like decreases, how to do decreases. I would recommend also learning how to do picking up of stitches, and I would also recommend learning German short rows. German short rows I find some people may classify a bit more as an intermediate technique. However, I find that German short rows really help with the fitting of the garment against your body, and so I would say that Even though it might be a little bit difficult to get the hang of at the start, I do think that it is really essential to know to start knitting your first garment, although it is not critical information to know. So if you don't want to learn all these things yet, you don't actually have to know them yet. But if you want to dive a little bit deeper, then I would recommend searching out these 3 new techniques. And one last thing that I want to teach you guys as well is how to read a simple pattern. Once again, I will be using the Step-by-Step Sweater by Florence Miller. For her case, it is mostly just words. There are no charts at all. So for charts, I will use a random image. In general, different pattern designers have different kinds of abbreviations. So when knitting a new designer's pattern, I would recommend looking through their abbreviations list just to see if they have a new way of writing things. So in general, I would say though that abbreviations like knit, purl, those are all quite standard. I want to say the general abbreviations are as follows over here. I think I'll add the list over here. So these are, I think, pretty standardized. Some people do write it a bit differently, so I recommend just referring back to the pattern designer's instructions. So after looking at all those abbreviations and legends, let's say you are knitting something that requires a design. For example, this is the tight loop top by Other Loops, and she did use a charted pattern for this top specifically because you can see that not every line is exactly the same. To create this wave-like effect, there are variations of knits and purls, and because of that, she decided to just use a chart instead, which looks something like that. I am obviously not using the chart from the tight loop top pattern because it is a paid pattern, and of course I don't want to share a paid pattern online, but in general I'm just using a random image. You just start reading charts from the bottom up. So you can see that the rows are basically corresponding to the rows that are over here. So this way down. And then the columns, you just read it basically like that. So it is the vertical side of things, and that corresponds to the garment itself. So you can see that there are numbers that indicate which column and which row it is at. So you want to start reading the pattern from right to left and bottom to top. So if you don't know where to start, just start at 1. So you're starting off with 1x1, which is the bottom rightmost box, okay? And then you work from that box, you work to the left. How I like to see it is you work in a snake-like manner. So you work right to left, and afterwards you see the number 2 there on the left-hand side. You work from right to left. And that's how you start reading the pattern. The pattern does guide you if you're going to move from knitting flat to knitting in a round, because if you're knitting in a round, then you just end up going from right to left non-stop. So it does change a little bit if you're knitting flat versus knitting in the round. The idea behind why you're working in a snake-like manner is because when you are, let's just use this as an example. This is the right side of my work. So if I'm working always from left to right? So I'm knitting this way and I'm going all the way to the end. After I'm done with this side, I am turning my work over and I'm starting from this side and working my way back. And because the last stitch that I knitted from the previous row, row 1, becomes the first stitch that I knit on row 2, then that's why I'm working from left to right. And that's just the explanation of why you have to work in an S-like manner. But if you don't understand that, it's fine. You just start working from where you first see the number. So if the number is on the right hand side, then that is the first stitch. And then you just work your way down the row. And if the number is on the left hand side, you start from that stitch and you work to the right. And of course, if you're working in a round, your first stitch will always be the first stitch. So the first stitch of row 1 will always be the first stitch of row 2 because you're working in a round and no longer flipping your work. And so you would just keep knitting from right to left, right to left. There is no working in a snake-like manner anymore. And it's fine because the numbers on the graph will tell you where the first stitch is. So it might be looking a little bit complicated right now because everything is a pictorial representation of the technique that you need to do. Not to fret, there's always a legend that is below the chart. And once again, every pattern designer has a different legend. But in general, if it's a blank square, it is a knit on the right side and a purl on the wrong side. And if it's a dot in the center, then it is a purl on the right side and a knit on the wrong side. So basically, let's just give an example. So let's say I am working the first row. So the odd numbers are usually corresponding to the right side of the work. Because it's the right side of the work, being that is row 1, the stitches are read as dot, blank, dot, blank, dot, blank, dot, blank, and then dot, blank one more time, which corresponds to purl, knit, and so on and so forth. That's how you read it. And then after you're done with row 1, you're going to row 2. So because 2 is on the left hand side, you start reading the chart from left to right. So it shows blank dot, but because it is an even number, I'm working on the wrong side of the work. So how I read it instead is purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. So you see that it is still the same thing as row 1, even though it is a blank first and then a dot. Simply because what the square means on one side means the opposite for the wrong side. And I hope this makes sense. It is not as complicated as how I try to explain it, but it is pretty difficult to put these explanations into words. But basically, the general rule of thumb to decide how to read a chart is you look at the numbers, start from the smallest number, work your way to the left and work your way to the top, and that's how you're done with the chart. And always refer to your legend because your legend will save you. And so we've come to the end of the second video titled Peri-knitting. I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you have not watched pre-knitting yet, then feel free to click the link in the description box down below. And also stay tuned for the last video titled Post-knitting, in which I share all about what to do with your garment after you're done knitting it, as well as how to store it, different resources that I would direct you guys to continue your own learning journey. So stay tuned for the last video and I'll see you guys then. Bye!